I'm glad you're here. My name is Joanne Donsky, and I'm co-chair of Congregation Beth-Am's Jewish and Israel Advocacy Committee, also known as Beth-Am Jayak. I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar. This program is co-sponsored by Beth-Am Jayak and the Z3 project of Oshman Family JCC. Before I introduce Rabbi Brody, I have a few items to cover. First, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. Second, I'd like to tell you a bit about the sponsoring groups. Beth-Am Jayak works through speakers and action alerts to unify and mobilize support for the security of the State of Israel, to counter the alarming growth of anti-Semitism, and to promote respect for Jews in the United States and beyond. The Z3 project of the Oshman Family JCC works to foster a fresh approach to Jewish engagement in the 21st century, fostering a thriving Jewish future through meaningful dialogue between diaspora Jewry and Israel, and promoting Jewish peoplehood, mutual understanding, and a shared destiny to unite Jewish communities across the globe. The Z3 annual conference is coming up soon on November 17th, and we hope that you can join us for that. Finally, after Rabbi Brody's talk today, there will be a chance to ask your questions. To ask a question, please click on the Q&A button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen at any time during or after Rabbi Brody's talk. Please make your question concise and ask it in the form of a question rather than a statement. And now I'm delighted to introduce Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody. Rabbi Brody's career has focused on making Jewish text accessible to broader audiences while applying them to complex contemporary social and ethical dilemmas. His writings have been cited in Israeli Supreme Court decisions and have appeared in a long list of publications, including Mosaic, Tablet, The Forward, and the Jewish Review of Books, to name only a few. His book, Ethics of Our Fighters, A Jewish View on War and Morality, was published last year, and his next book, Judaism Confronts War, Jewish Military Ethics for the 21st Century, will be published in both Hebrew and English soon. A summa cum laude graduate of Harvard College, he received rabbinic ordination from the Israeli Chief Rabbinate, an MA in Jewish philosophy at the Hebrew University, and his PhD from Bar Ilan University Law School. In addition to all of this, Rabbi Brody is the Executive Director of Ematai, an organization dedicated to helping people navigate dilemmas regarding aging, end-of-life care, and organ donation. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody.
Thank you so much. Good morning. It's good to be here with you. I'm coming to you live from Modi'in, Israel. And thank you to the Beth-Am team and to the Z3 project for this wonderful opportunity to discuss with you some of the really difficult dilemmas that Israel is facing and that Zionists are facing both in Israel and around the world. As I mentioned, I'm in Israel right now in the city of Modi'in. Unfortunately, we've just had our 30th funeral here since October 7th, and people have died in the war, either on October 7th or in battles. And this has been a particularly difficult day, or two actually at this point, with many losses, particularly in Lebanon. Precisely because of that, it's so important for us as Jews, as Israelis, Zionists, to think long and hard about why we fight and how we fight. I have to say that I've been a bit disappointed that the general discourse in the world when it comes to this war, that there's a real tool set of ways of thinking about the ethics of when you go to war and how you fight a war that's more or less been ignored in a lot of different ways. And it's really, in some ways, just being overly politicized, sort of a TikTok generation. Only thing people pay attention to are images, and there are much broader and deeper and nuanced questions to be asked. I as things turned out, actually the book that was made a reference to earlier came out in January. Obviously, it was written before October 7th. Occasionally, people ask me if I wrote this book on October 8th. I did not write the book on October 8th. The book is called Ethics of Our Fighters, A Jewish View on War and Morality. You can get it on Amazon, anywhere else, bookstores, from Magid Books. And since the book came out, I guess basically January 1st, 2024, I've spoken, I don't know, dozens, maybe even hundreds of times at this point about the war for different audiences in Israel, America, Canada, UK, and elsewhere. And I'm never amazed. I never cease to be amazed by the fact of how much confusion there is out there about not just about military ethics, but also about what Judaism has to say about this topic. Because what I want to try to cover today is not just the question of civilian casualties in Israel's dilemma, which of course is front and center on everyone's mind, because as we have lost many soldiers in the past day or two, we also should acknowledge the fact that others have died, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza or Syria or in Iran. Israel's been pretty active. And, I'm not really crying for the losses of people like Nasrallah and Hezbollah fighters, but certainly many non-combatants, including children, have died in this war on the other side. And that's a very sad phenomenon, a sad fact, a tragedy, which we mourn. And I want to try to, therefore, clarify a little bit about the ethical dilemmas, but also to say something about what Judaism has to contribute to this conversation. The reason why I call the book Ethics of Our Fighters is a play on words, of course, from the famous book Ethics of Our Fathers. And when you think of Judaism, you think of ethics of our fathers, right? We're sort of like these Pirkei Avot, right? The teachings, the moral teachings. But if you look carefully in that book and many other places, you don't see a whole lot about military ethics, about the ethics of warfare. And that's for a very simple reason. For many centuries, Jews really were powerless, right? We weren't fighting in wars, whether our own wars or other people's wars. And so we didn't develop a whole theory and practice of how we should fight ethically. And with the inclusion of Jews in 19th and early 20th century Western wars, and then of course with the advent of Zionism, we've had to think anew about these questions. And many people are very nervous when you say, I want to talk about religion in war, because the assumption, and we have good reasons to understand why this assumption is that the assumption is that religion is going to fester warfare. Religion is going to increase or generate violence or fundamentalism. And of course, Israel feels this greatly. We see this, how Islamic fundamentalism has sort of taken over or usurped, or however you want to formulate it, Islam in one form or another, or certain strands of Islam, in order to create violent threats, whether it's ISIS or Al Qaeda or Hamas or Hezbollah or others. And there's this fear that the same would be true if Jews are speaking about this from a religious perspective. And the truth is that, I think we don't have to be, maybe we'll find it embarrassing, but we shouldn't hide from the fact that occasionally you do hear some voices in the Israeli or the Jewish scene that seem a little bit more fundamentalist when it comes to these issues. And one of the things I want to try to develop with you isn't just about this particular issue, but to discuss also how Judaism might think about some of the dilemmas that the IDF faces, that we face on the battlefields today, with regard to civilian casualties, as a paradigm for how Judaism can provide a nuanced perspective on some of the extremes that we see in the discourse today. And in order for us to delve into this topic, I want to tell you a tale of two sieges that took place in Jewish history. And from this tale of two sieges, to delve in a little bit about what Judaism might have to say about this broad topic. Now, just to clarify, there's a lot of talk about Israel having some form of siege warfare on Gaza in the beginning of the war. This was actually not true. Part of the misinformation about the war sort of pegged this as having a siege, but one of the borders, as you know, was controlled by Egypt. And in many ways, some of the humanitarian issues would have been alleviated had the Egyptians opened the borders for refugees, which is what we expect in other places, which we've certainly seen from Syrian refugees, which have transformed many European countries and many other places around the world. And for whatever reason, from Egypt, for their own political reasons, or for whatever reason, the rest of the world let Egypt get away with this. But now, you could argue that now that Israel controls the Philadelphia corridor, sort of controls the border, it does have a siege. And certainly, in the tale I'm going to tell you today, there was a siege going on. And this brings us back to the year of 1982. 1982 was the beginning of what's now known as the First Lebanon War. It was then known as Operation Peace of Galilee. And the reason why it was called Operation Peace of Galilee is very simple. The Galilee kept on being struck, whether in one form or another, by terrorist raids or attacks, or occasionally by rockets and other things from South Lebanon, by the Palestine Liberation Organization, led by Yasser Arafat, the PLO. And in 1978, a few years beforehand, Israel had tried to push the PLO back away from the border beyond the Litani River, the same exact Litani River that's in the headlines today that we're still talking about today as well. And that was a short-lived success of that operation. And after a few other attempts, diplomacy and whatnot, in the summer of 1982, Israel launches what is then known as Operation Peace of Galilee, was later known as the First Lebanon War, and now seems to be the first of three Lebanon wars. And it's a complicated war. It's the decision making there was complicated. I won't get into it right now. I discussed it a bit in my book, and it was not Israel's best war in different ways. But that's not what we're going to focus on right now, because the part I want to focus on is what happens in July 1982. Israel has made its way up the coast, has made its way up southern Lebanon, and it has gone past the Litani River. Whether or not this was supported by the cabinet or not, or this idea of the defense minister, isn't our conversation right now. And in any case, Israel actually, in July of 1982, lays a proper siege around the city of Beirut. Okay, this is a proper siege, four sides being sort of surrounded by IDF forces, with the idea being that Yasser Arafat and many of his henchmen, probably about 14,000 of them, are in Beirut. And the only way to get rid of this threat to the Galilee, to southern Lebanon, is by ridding Lebanon entirely of the presence of the PLO. And the man on the bottom right corner, a man, as you can see from the hat that he's wearing, this is a little bit of a dated photo, who is a man of distinguished military history, who had fought in Israel's earliest wars, and then became Israel's IDF's, first chief rabbi, head chaplain, the man who blows the shofar at the Western Wall in 1967, Rabbi Shlomo Brody, who is then the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, declares and what you might say drops an ethical bombshell. And he says, listen, friends, Israel is obligated under Jewish law to leave open a fourth side. That is to say, it has to create an evacuation corridor that lets anyone who wants to leave Beirut. This is a law. This is a binding halakha, a binding ruling of Jewish law. You don't have to let people or items into the city, but you do have to let people flee for their lives out of Beirut. And this creates a bit of a brouhaha, probably because of who he is and his military history, but also because people are like, hello, Rabbi Goren, don't you know how it works with sieges? The whole point of a siege, which is like the oldest form of warfare in the books, is to surround on all four sides. If you let people leave, it's not really a siege. And indeed, the man on the top right corner, a man also of great distinction, a rabbi of great distinction in the religious Zionist world by the name of Rabbi Shaul Israeli, who's the head, Yeshiva seminary head, Merkaz Arav in Jerusalem, declares, Rabbi Gorn, you got this wrong. There's no such obligation under Jewish law. And so there's a very fascinating discussion here because Rabbi Israeli says, listen, if we can, and this is important to stress, Rabbi Israeli says, if we can let non-combatants out and flee, sure, yeah, we should let them out. But you cannot create a situation where you create an evacuation corridor, which will allow not only non-combatants to flee, but combatants to flee. The whole point of a siege is to rid the city, not just of those people, but the threat of those fighters. And if it was just that you were trying to conquer the territory, well, that'd be one thing. Meaning, if it's such a situation in which you wanted to send them northwards, okay, fine. But here's a situation where we're not just looking to conquer a territory, a piece of land. We're actually less interested about Beirut and more interested in the inhabitants of Beirut, namely and particularly the terrorists, the 14,000 plus, including Yasser Arafat, who are there. And if that's the case, you cannot create a situation in which you have an evacuation corridor that allows combatants and non-combatants alike to flee. So this is the starting of our debate, and it's a fascinating one. And I want to delve into a little bit about where this comes from and what this might say about Jewish views on war and morality. Now, when it comes to, thinking about war and morality, so I think we can establish a little bit of some of the general principles that we have to keep in mind. We all know this is a picture here of the Isaiah wall by the UN, which quotes the famous verses stated both in Isaiah as well in the book of Micah, Sefer Micha, in which we talk about the prophecy of they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Very, very powerful, important prophecy, vision, something which we aspire for. And yet, in the same chapter in the book of Micah, we're also told that God will give you horns of iron and provide you with hooves of bronze, and you will crush the many people. Meaning it's understood that we might strive for peace and have an aspiration for this. But at times, there is a reality of warfare. And warfare is very, very difficult for us because we very much believe that all humans were created in the image of God. This is actually very appropriate to discuss because it came up in yesterday's Torah reading in the beginning of the book of Genesis, Sefer Bereshit, and particularly comes up in this upcoming Torah portion when we discuss the idea after the flood that whoever sheds human blood, right, the person should be killed because all humans were created in the image of God. A very, very powerful, important principle. You can never forget. All humans, friends and foes alike, were created in the image of God, and this imbues people with inherent human dignity. Moreover, even though this seems to be a matter of dispute in some biblical texts, it becomes clear as we look in the book of Ezekiel and other places, we also believe, following this principle of human dignity, that all humans created in the image of God. Not just that you can't kill people in general, you have to be careful about that, but also we believe in individual responsibility. Right? Ish bechet'o yumat. The person should die for their sins alone, and not the sins of their mother, their father, their sister, their brother, their neighbor, ancestor, and whatnot. So all of this is quite important in Jewish thinking, but we also see in the book, the Bible as well, much warfare. And it is understood that there is a necessity of moral fortitude to fight evil. It's already from Abraham, 2 weeks Parsha, right? In Parsha Lech Lecha, coming up in 2 weeks. And you see it throughout the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, and beyond. This idea of being strong and resolute, of being courageous in war, of not being fearful, of understanding the importance that sometimes there are threats to you and your people, and you have to go to war. And, this is a little bit of jumping ahead in some respects, but I want to share with you, just to give you a little bit of a framework before I get back to this siege, about how I think about some of these issues in general. And I've tried in the book and elsewhere to lay out some general principles of military ethics, including the dignity of mankind, inherent wrong of illicit bloodshed, this belief in individual responsibility, our vision or aspiration for world peace, but are also understanding that there's going to be need at time for warfare, to defend people, to rid evil from our midst. Warfare is by its nature collective. That's the nature of war. And in a war, we're going to have partiality to our own people, because part and parcel of what we're trying to do, the whole justification of going to war, is to defend our own people. And we're going to need physical and moral bravery and courage, which is going to include protecting our honor. An honor which says you can't act in an unethical manner that would disgrace our reputation, but also we don't have a situation like we saw on October 7th, like we saw throughout Jewish history, that Jews can be downtrodden and killed without any form of response, and easily as an element of mass ridicule. So there are a number of different factors in which we have to keep in mind in general. And we're going to come back to this because I think, in fact, that part of the problem that we have today in much of the West is we've lost sight of the fact that there are multiple values to keep in mind. And I think that this balance of values comes out very clearly in the discussion of this first siege, in the tale of two sieges. Because here's my question. Where in the world did Rabbi Shlomo Brody, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, a man of great distinguished military history, come up with this idea, which says that when you lay siege on a city, you have to leave open the fourth side? So there isn't a whole lot about military ethics in the Bible, but one passage, which does talk about this a little bit in the book of Deuteronomy, does talk about precisely in the time of a siege, when in your war against the city, you have to besiege a long time, don't destroy its trees, as it makes clear, particularly the fruit-bearing trees, right? This is very important. It seems to be a very important principle of what you might call scorched earth policy. We don't want to have scorched earth policy, right? This is not something which we're trying to do. We want to protect the environment. We want to protect the future. We're not looking to be overly destructive. But the passage which really, I think, comes up very important, comes up here as well, same chapter in the book of Deuteronomy, which tells us the following, that when you go to war, offer peace. And Maimonides, when he codifies this, says this applies in all wars. It doesn't matter. And in fact, he gets this idea from a really interesting midrash, or rabbinic text, which you can see on the right side of your screen right now, which tells us that God originally told Moses, go and destroy the cities. And Moses says back to him, am I to go and smite them? I do not know who has sinned and who has not sinned. Meaning, I don't want to just go to war and fight against people, because if I go and try to destroy everyone, there may be many people I'm going to be killing there who have not sinned against me, right? Who are not threatening me, who haven't done anything wrong, and therefore I don't want to just go to war. I want that to be a last resort. I want to first offer them peace. And God says to Moses, you are right. This is, according to Midrash, this is what you should do. But here's the thing. There are many times in history where you can have a situation where people can offer peace, so they can offer surrender and all sorts of things, and they don't agree to any form of deal. And the war starts, therefore. And the question becomes, once the war starts, do we then have a responsibility to still care about those who haven't sinned against us, right? Which we might call today the non-combatants, particularly regarding children, but others as well, those who have not harmed us. Do we have to care about this as well? And that seems to be what Rabbi Goren was getting at in that siege of Beirut. And it comes from a very interesting, another midrash, which tells us the following, that in the 2nd century BCE, there's a sage by the name of Rabbi Natan, who lives in Babylonia, although makes it to the land of Israel, to Eretz Israel, towards the end. So the middle part, of the 2nd century CE, after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, a little bit after 135 CE. And he teaches that when you lay siege, you leave a fourth side open for them to flee. And Maimonides codifies this as well and says you cannot surround all four sides, but only on three. A place should be left for the inhabitants to flee and for all those who desire to escape with their lives. And of course, you might say, well, where is that taught in the Torah? And he quotes a verse from Numbers, and my mind says, yeah, I agree. There's no such verse in the Torah, but there's a tradition. In Hebrew, a shmua, a tradition, an oral tradition, an oral teaching, which says that in the midst of war, you got to lay siege in this manner and let anyone who desires to flee for their lives. And it's very fascinating because the obvious question to ask is, well, what's the rationale here? Like, what are we doing here? Like, don't you know how to fight war, sieges, right? Don't we know something about this? And it's very fascinating that two explanations are given by the commentators. And I want to share with you from a 13th century commentator named the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe Nachmanides, who tells us that we are commanded to, that we lay siege on a city to leave one direction open. So if they want to flee, they can do so. And there are two rationales. Fascinating. One is a strategic argument, which says as follows. If you lay siege on a city and you don't let people flee, then what are they going to do? They're going to fight to the very bitter end because what choice do they have? So you might as well fight. But if you allow people to flee, they might say, well, okay, you know what? This isn't worth it. I'll make it a lot easier to win the battle. So there's a strategic element to this argument. But there's also a humanitarian, if you will, argument as well. As the Ramban says, from this we learn to act with compassion, even toward our enemies at the time of war. Very, very interesting. Teaching 13th century rabbi in Spain who tells us in the midst of war, you have to have compassion and let people flee for their lives. Right? Now, where in the world did the Jewish tradition get this from? I mean, let's think about it for a moment. It's not anywhere written in the Torah, right? I mean, Maimonides himself said it was just an oral tradition. And there are those who say that perhaps they learned it from the Romans, right? And there's Rabbi Natan, who's living in the 2nd century, learned this from Roman strategists. In fact, one of the great scholars of the previous couple of generations by the name of Rabbi Saul Lieberman of JTS, of the Jewish Theological Seminary. So Rabbi Lieberman, in his commentary, says that he did some research and he found that there are a couple of 1st and maybe early 2nd century Roman strategists who come up with the same idea. It's a minority opinion. Most military strategists in the 1st and 2nd century say the way you lay a siege is you surround it entirely. You try to starve people to death. But there are a couple of strategists who give this idea that it'll be easier to win the siege if you let people flee. And Rabbi Lieberman says maybe this is where Rabbi Natan got it from. I mean, it's always possible, I guess. But, there's no evidence of that by any means. And you have to wonder, how did this 2nd century rabbi who's living in Babylonia hear about? I don't know. There's no, could be, it's possible. There's another argument, which I think is much more interesting and compelling, which says that Rabbi Natan learned this from Moses himself. Remember, we said that Moses fought with God and said, you gotta, before you go to war, offer them to surrender because we don't want to kill those who haven't sinned against us. And what some say is that principle applies not just before you start war, but even once the war starts itself. Right? The fact that the other side chose war doesn't mean you still don't have to try to show some form of compassion, even in the midst of war. Now, that's a very interesting idea. But the question you have to ask is, well, where in the world do we get that idea from? And here I want to ask a broader question and make a suggestion, which I cannot prove to you, but I'm utterly convinced it's true, even though I can't prove to you, which relates to a broader question as follows. Is there anything that the Jewish people learned from the centuries of us being subjugated to torture, to persecution, to inquisitions and Holocaust? Does that historical experience somehow impact the way we too think about military? And I have a suggestion, which I cannot prove to you, but I have a feeling that Rabbi Natan's teaching was somehow influenced by the Jewish experience of being on the bad side of a siege. Because you see, my friends, Jews know quite a lot about sieges. We know about it from the time of the first temple's destruction in 586 BC. We know it from the time of the second temple's destruction, and we know it from the time of the fall of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, from the fall of the city of Beitar. Jews are on the bad end of sieges many times, and our text describe this at length. So when it comes to the first temple's destruction, 586 BC, it comes up, it's described the hunger and the thirst from the multi-year siege of Jerusalem is described sort of in brief in the book of Kings, second book of Kings, but really gets described at length in the book of Lamentations, Sefer Eicha, read every year on the Tisha B'Av fast day. In fact, there's a fast day called the 10th of a Tevet in the wintertime, a Sarah Tevet, which Jews, many Jews still traditionally observe, which is a fast which commemorates the beginning of the siege, not the destruction of the temple, which is marked on Tisha B'Av, or even the fall of the walls of Jerusalem on the 17th of Tammuz, but rather the beginning of the siege. Why? Why is there fasting to memorialize the beginning of the siege? And the answer is because Jews suffered greatly during sieges. And the book of Lamentations describes what happens in the time of the first temple and how the finest of people are now debased and people are starving at street corners and their people turn cruel, right? Everyone, little children begging for bread, but no one gives them anything. Those used to feast on pastries, on dainties, right? Lay famished in the streets. Those used to wear fancy clothing now embrace refuse heaps, right? Garbage cans, right? They're looking for anything. You can't even recognize people because their faces are blacker than soot. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become dry as wood. And the prophet explains, Jeremiah describes and Achan says, better off with the slain of the sword than those slain by famine. Meaning, it would have been better to have a quick and relatively painless death at the hand of the sword than to slowly wither away from famine. And in fact, we even described how women would cook their own children in order to eat their flesh, in order to survive. And this happens in the times of the first temple, and it happens as well in the times of the second temple. Now, we know this from the sages and the Talmud, but we also know this from the Jewish trader, Roman historian Josephus, who tells us in describing the incidents that happened at the time of the second temple's destruction about a situation where, once again, not just a woman would cook the flesh of their dead children, but a woman in Jerusalem actually killed her child in order to eat the flesh. And the Romans hear about this and they're in disbelief. And some have pity from the distress which the Jews were under, but many of them didn't care one bit because they hate the Jews so much. And they go to Caesar and say to Caesar, Caesar, you see what we're doing to these people? And Caesar says, it ain't my fault. He excuses himself before God and said, I offer them peace and liberty, but they chose oblivion. I offer them concord. They chose sedition. I offer them peace. They chose war. I offer them satiety and abundance, and they chose famine. Meaning, once they chose to fight, not to surrender, it's all on them. And this happens as well with the fall of Beitar, once again, at the hand of a siege in the 2nd century. So here's my question to you. Where did Rabbi Natan in the 2nd century get this idea from? I can't prove I'm going to say to you. But I have a feeling Rabbi Natan, who comes to Eretz Yisrael after the fall of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, knowing very well what has happened to the Jews in the times of the first temple and the second temple, and he goes and declares, if Jews ever get power again, if Jews ever lay siege again, we're not going to do what others did to us. Even once the war starts, Caesar, you still have to show some compassion. You've got to let people flee for their lives. If they don't want to fight us, they want to flee for their lives, you let them flee and keep the fourth side open. Very powerful statement of Rabbi Natan. And it gets codified into Jewish law by Maimonides, Nachmanides, and others. But here's the question. How many times since Rabbi Natan made his declaration in the 2nd century did Jews have the opportunity to implement this law? Meaning, in practice, how many times did Jews lay sieges from the 2nd century onwards until Zionism, until maybe 1982? And the answer might be that this was the first time since Rabbi Natan made his declaration in which Jews could actually think about whether or how to implement this teaching. There was a siege, not around the city, but around the 3rd Brigade of the Egyptian Army in 1973. But that's a different situation, not exactly the same. And it's possible that until 1982, there just quite simply wasn't another occasion in which Jews had the opportunity to implement this teaching. And so Rabbi Gore comes and says, Jewish law requires us to leave the fourth side open and to create an evacuation corridor. Who does the IDF follow? Rabbi Israeli, who says, no, it doesn't apply in these cases for a variety of technical reasons we'll get to right now, or Rabbi Gore? And the answer is they didn't ask either of them, right? But in practice, the IDF leaves open a fourth side. It leaves open 2 evacuation corridors, and many, many people, seemingly 100,000 people, flee through 2 evacuation corridors. Now, ultimately, after 2 months, many of these thousands of PLO terrorists are able to leave Beirut after a ceasefire is negotiated by the Reagan administration, with the idea being that the PLO is supposed to leave Lebanon entirely. And during this siege, 1,000 PLO fighters died, along with 88 Israeli soldiers. Now, the terms of the numbers of non-combatants is hard to know because the head of the Lebanese Red Cross was Yasser Arafat's brother. Not exactly the most reliable source. And the same issues we have today, we don't really know how many people are killed in Gaza because it's coming from Hamas-controlled health ministry. So too, we don't really know, or didn't know at the time, but we've since, investigated and researched this war at length. And Richard Gabriel, who wrote a pretty good book on it called Operation Peace of Galilee, he's an American, not an Israeli, right? So he writes, he thinks it's about 5,000 non-combatants were killed, with another 20, 30,000 wounded. That's a lot of people. Just sad, tragic in many ways. But given the fact that the PLO was fighting in civilian territory, they purposely placed themselves within an urban environment. This actually was a remarkably small amount of casualties. And this was actually acknowledged by the International Red Cross, which is today, I don't think anyone would imagine making such a statement like this. But a few years later, one of their lead lawyers wrote an article, The Civilian in the Crossfire, in which she asserts that the Israeli bombardment of Beirut in June and July of 1982 resulted in high civilian casualties, but not necessarily excessively so, given the fact that military targets were placed amongst the civilian population. Meaning, if the PLO is going to place military targets, its fighters, its weapons, in the midst of civilians, well, of course, there's going to be high civilian casualties. But Israel was not excessive in its force. And in fact, probably I think the best book on the First Lebanon War, called A Flawed Victory, which, as you can tell by the title, has what to critique about this war. but it was written by two American military historians who were in Beirut, in Lebanon during the war, meaning they're actually eyewitnesses to many of the major scenes and sites. They wrote as follows: as military historians, we can think of no war in which greater military advantages were gained in combat in densely populated areas at such a small cost in civilian lives lost and property damage. And this despite the PLO's deliberate placement of weapons in civilian communities. Pretty remarkable statement. These aren't Jews, these aren't Zionists, these aren't Israelis. There's two American military historians who say we can think of no war in which greater military advantages were gained in combat in densely populated areas at such a small cost, despite what the PLO was doing by deliberately placing weapons in civilian communities. A really remarkable, remarkable statement. And Rabbi Goren gets up at the end of these 2 months of the war, of the siege, when the siege ends, and says, what a Kiddush Hashem. What a sanctification of the name of God that Israel created these two evacuation corridors and allowed these 100,000 people to flee. But my friends, I promised you a tale of two sieges. And the story gets a little bit more complicated because it's a little bit of a complicated story, but to make it, summarize it, Arafat and his men are supposed to leave Lebanon entirely, but they don't. And the whole situation gets very complicated in Lebanon because the group and the leader that Israel thinks will take over Lebanon and create a peace deal with it is assassinated. And this leads to the killing by Israel's allies of Palestinians in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. And Lebanon sort of falls into a partial civil war again. And Israel's having a hard time extracting itself from the situation. And not shockingly, Arafat and his men don't keep their deal, and they make it back to Lebanon. And they're now holed up, and by the end of 1983, in the city of Tripoli, the coastal town of Tripoli in Lebanon, right? Not the North African one, the Lebanese town of Tripoli. And this is actually an interesting situation because they're surrounded. They have the coast on one side, and they're surrounded the city by Arab rebels who think the PLO are too moderate. Right? There is opponents of the PLO who are fighting against the PLO. And then in December 1983, there's a bus bombing in Jerusalem that kills several Israelis, and the PLO and the rebels take responsibility for it. Israel says enough is enough. We're going to not allow Arafat to flee again. And Israel lays siege on Tripoli on the fourth side on the coast, saying, you got three sides that are fighting there. We're not going to let him run away once again. And under incredible American pressure, once again, Israel allows Arafat to flee. And there's a rabbi of great military distinction, a man who had fought in Israel's earliest wars and who had served in the army subsequently, a man who knows something about warfare, who gets up and says, this is terrible. It goes against Jewish law to have opened the fourth side and to allow Arafat and his men to flee. And the name of that rabbi is Rabbi Shlomo Brody, the Ashkenazic chief rabbi. And people look at Rabbi Goren and say, hello, 16 months ago, when there was a siege on Beirut, you said it was an imperative of Jewish law to leave a fourth side open. Now you're telling us that it was horrible that they let the men out, left the fourth side open? Weren't you the one who said there's an absolute obligation to leave open evacuation corridor? Now, Rabbi Goren has a technical answer to this question. And his technical answer is that that's only true if we are laying siege on all four sides. But in this case, we only had one side being laid siege to. And if you want some humanitarianism, he says sort of cynically, right, sort of sarcastically, tell the Arab rebels who are opposing the PLO to let Arafat and his men flee. Meaning, he sort of says, there's no such obligation. People say back then, but you said it was a bona fide law. And I think you could argue and say, well, maybe it's only a get out of jail free card once, meaning you're allowed, you're supposed to let people flee, but only once. If they come back, well, then they're responsible for that. That could be. But I think what actually happened in this case is that Rabbi Goren got stuck. And he got stuck because originally he asserted there's a bona fide law. But if the bona fide law, so to speak, of leaving the foresight open is going to undermine the entire military mission, it's not going to allow you to decisively defeat your enemy and therefore protect your people, then there's a balance of different values that has to always be taken into account. And part and parcel of what Jewish law demands is that we keep in mind the balance of these values as we try to think about, well, how do we, on the one hand, defend our people, protect our citizens and our soldiers and our interests, but at the same time, never lose sight of the fact that all humans are created in the image of God, and those who have not sinned against us, we don't want them to die. We have no interest in that. And I think that this is precisely the challenge which we have both then and today. If you go back to some of the values which I started off with, I try to present to you, so you'll see here that there are, I think, many values here that people can relate to, right? We understand the dignity of mankind. We understand what individual responsibility. We also understand that we need to sometimes pursue war in order to defend our people, in order to rid the evil and the clear and present danger from our midst. And that is going to cause us to prioritize saving our own, because that's why you go to war. That is a moral imperative. And what drives me up the wall is sometimes you hear people say, well, on the one hand, Israel has to think about its interests, to defeat Hamas or Hezbollah. On the other hand, has to think about humanitarianism. No. That's a terrible binary equation of thinking about this. Because do we not have a moral, ethical imperative to defend our own people? To make sure that October 7th can be repeated, whether it's in the South or in the North? To make sure that we don't have ayatollahs of nuclear bombs that could literally wipe out the state? Is that just a matter of interest? Or is that a moral imperative? October 7th wasn't just a strategic failure, it was a moral failure that we didn't protect our own people. And so you have a balance of competing moral ideas and moral agendas here. And that being the case, what scares me the most is when people lose sight of the fact that this isn't a matter of interest versus morality, right? But it's rather a matter of competing moral values, and we have to try to balance some of that out in a very complex environment, which gets even more complex by the fact that we're fighting an enemy which doesn't seem to mind, as has been made clear by both the Wall Street Journal and New York Times exposés, doesn't seem to mind losing its own people for the greater cause, to make them shahidim, right, to make them martyrs. And so that becomes very, very difficult. And what scares me the most are what I call the fundamentalists. And the fundamentalists, in my mind, are the people who assert that the only thing that matters is one value. One type, that's how I define a fundamentalist. So one type of fundamentalist says the only thing that matters is Israel wins. Israel defeats its enemies. And this, by the way, it could be America, right? It could be other countries, whatever it might be. The only thing that matters is that we win. Now, of course, it's very important we win. It's important to defend our people. I get it. We've had 30 funerals in Modin, where I live, from October 7th and beyond. And, we've lost a lot. Someone today was killed, Rabbi Avi Goldberg, somebody I used to work with in Yeshivat HaKotel. My nephew is back in Lebanon right now. My daughter is just started the army. She's near the Glilot base, which just had seems like a terrorist attack today, right? I got it. You don't need to explain it to me. We got to win. We got to win. But that doesn't mean that when we're trying to win and defend our people, that we don't have to keep in mind other values, including the fact that on the other side, there are people that are created in the image of God. Right? It's fundamentalistic to think just in terms of one value. And the same is true for the fundamentalists you find in the West, unfortunately, who only care about one value and say the value that matters is rights, human rights. What right do you have to cause suffering of those who aren't fighting against you? Now, there's no doubt there's much suffering, and that is a tragic fact of this war and of war in general. But what other solution do you have for us to deal with the moral imperative of defending our people? Come up with a better way. But when you're fighting against an enemy, which doesn't just fight amongst civilians, but fights underneath its civilians, that literally uses them as a human shield, what solution do you have? And if that's the case, that you don't, and I don't think they do, then you're just being a fundamentalist when you say that all that matters is these images, which are terrible. Yes, the images are terrible. Absolutely. It's tragic. That doesn't tell us a single thing of who has moral responsibility for those images, for those deaths, which is much, much more complex than a 20-second TikTok video. And I am very fearful of the fundamentalism that you see in the West that doesn't take into account these other values. And I think precisely what Judaism teaches us is to take into account these different values. Now, we're going to have to always be thinking about these things as a whole. And as we continue in this war, and I don't know, will this war end in a week? There's all sorts of talks about ceasefires, this or that, who knows? Or is this going to go on for a long time? I fear in one form or another, this is going to be going on for an extended period. And that being the case, Israel and its supporters around the world, Jews and non-Jews alike, are going to have to build up a tremendous amount of physical fortitude. We're going to need weapons and weapons supplies from our allies like the United States, other places. We're going to need diplomatic acumen, wisdom about how to navigate a very complex geopolitical situation. But we're also going to need moral fortitude, not just physical fortitude, but moral fortitude, a moral understanding of why we fight and how we fight. And of course, Israel should do the best it can in doing what's known as hasbara, explaining, right? Getting those videos out there, explaining why we're attacking hospitals, because those hospitals are being used as military bases and places to use patients to shield military leaders and whatnot. Of course, we have to do everything we can. We should do everything we can, do better hasbara, explaining what we're doing. But ultimately, we're facing many, many forces that don't care about the military ethical dilemmas here and the difficulties in the balancing of these values. And for one reason or another, are against Israel for one reason or another. And of course, there can be legitimate critique of some of the decisions Israel makes. Within Israel as well, there's legitimate critique in different directions. That's part of what a healthy democracy is all about. And a healthy moral tradition like Judaism, which takes into account these different values, is by its nature going to lead people to disagree about how you balance those values in one form or another. So, of course, there's going to be discourse and disagreement and sometimes critique, and that's fine. But what is going to be so critical is for us to be able to maintain these framework, this moral framework of these multiple values, a multi-value framework of keeping these in mind. And I hope and pray we can do all we can to explain ourselves to the world. But at least for ourselves, for Jews, for those who care about the Zionist enterprise and the Zionist cause, we should make sure we understand for ourselves why we fight and how we fight. And that's why I've been trying to speak and write about this issue. Since the beginning of the war, I have my own very, very modest contribution to what we're doing, because I think it's so important. And against all odds, Judaism actually has an ethics of our fighters. Judaism actually has sources. as Rabbi Natan taught, and Maimonides, and Nachmanides, and Rabbi Goren taught, which can teach us something about how to fight and why we fight and how to fight. And so I hope that at least we learn from this tale of two sieges that Judaism has something to teach about the balance of values that are at play, and that we can have now a conversation, some questions and discussions about how these values applied both in 1982 and in 2024 as well. Joanne, I'll turn it back to you to begin the Q&A part of our process.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi Brody, for your enlightening and thought-provoking talk. Now we're going to move on to questions from our viewers. As a reminder to those of you in the audience, to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Please make your question concise and ask it in the form of a question, not a statement. Okay, let's begin. And we do have some questions here. Okay, first, the media, this is from Stuart. The media on a daily basis depicts mayhem and rubble, dead bodies and injured babies in Lebanon and Gaza, where Israel is eliminating terrorists, implying that Israel is daily committing war crimes. Yet Sir Richard Kemp, head of the British forces in Afghanistan, says the IDF is the most moral army in the world. And Colonel John Spencer, head of the Modern War Institute at West Point, says, and also chair of the Urban Warfare Studies Department, says, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history and beyond what international law requires. So why does Israel not take issue with the media by promulgating a media blitz of its own?
Yeah, I mean, the question is a fair one. It's a complex issue about how to handle the media. I actually, I think Israel has tried a lot of different ways to try to there have been times maybe it could have done better, but give access to understanding of why what it is doing and why that's been necessary in different circumstances. But the speed of the images and how they get delivered today is much, much, much worse for these factors than it was, let's say, even the first Lebanon War. In the first Lebanon War, we had to worry about what we called the CNN effect. And the CNN effect was sort of these images are being broadcast across the world now, CNN. And, how do we manage that? And you can say if you're dealing with a couple of news, broadcasters, whatever it might be, you can manage that. Today, any image show you no context whatsoever of rubble or this or that can be sent across the world in 3 seconds. Right? So that's very, very hard to combat. I think Israel has launched a lot of media blitzes and has tried to clarify these things. And people like Kemp and Spencer have been excellent. But we have many, many people who don't like Israel, who don't like Jews, who don't like Zionism, who are very much interested in pushing against this. And unfortunately, though, we also live in a bit of a superficial world, which is deeply impacted by pictures. And that is part of the problem of the TikTok generation. I don't mean the age, but I mean the era that we live in of social media and pictures. I mean, these are very sad pictures, but it tells us absolutely nothing about who bears moral responsibility for that situation. And so this is a problem which it's not just a problem of Israel. I mean, Israel faces this right now because we're the only country in the West that has to really defend itself. America, of course, we had 9/11, but which was terrible and tragic, but the American borders haven't really been threatened in that way, and so in that Canadian or French or British, in any serious way in multiple generations. And so people have no sense of what it means to fight in these circumstances and who we're fighting against and what this looks like. The reason why someone like Kemp and others are valuable is because They fought in urban warfare without getting to the justice of the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. And they understand, right, what it means to fight in these circumstances. So, I think Israel could do a better job sometimes publicizing this, but we're fighting a very, very difficult uphill battle on these questions.
Thank you. Whoops, thank you. And along the same lines, the world sees babies, women, and children being killed by Israeli bombs, and the accusation of genocide is then used as anti-Israel propaganda. How do we respond?
Well, it's an outrage, the genocide claim, and I want to explain why. I mean, genocide is a term that was coined actually by Jews, by Holocaust survivors, people who have fled, refugees from the Holocaust, like people like Richard Lemkin and others, Lauterpacht and others, who were trying to explain a situation in which there is the purposeful killing of a people, a part of a people, with the goal of destroying this people and population. It's an outrage for such a claim to be made against Israel. When, if you look at the numbers, even if you trust the Hamas numbers, let's say 42,000 or so killed, very tragic, of which Israel thinks about 17,000 are Hamas members. So you look at that ratio and compare it to what America did in Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other countries around the world. And you see that the ratio of combatants to non-combatants killed is quite low. I mean, it's maybe 1 to 2, whatever it might be, which is much lower than it is in other situations. There's nothing like genocide going on here. What you do have is a situation in which a terrorist group took over or was elected by Gazan citizens, then took over in a violent coup and has held that population hostage and has endangered those people. But Israel doesn't have much of a choice except for to fight and root out Hamas from this situation. And we should have realized that before October 7th, but certainly the world should understand that after October 7th. And so while it's tragic that there are people that are killed as collateral damage, tragically, not purposely targeted, there's absolutely zero proof of Israel purposely targeting non-combatants, women and children, as a strategy or anything like that. That's why it's such a travesty when you hear such accusation. It is very sad, and those pictures are very sad, but it tells you nothing about the moral guilt. If you look in American um, 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 American rules of warfare, the American Army, the British Army, who try to balance ethics and international law, they all talk about the phenomenon, which is very understandable, that we're going to have tragic collateral damage, right? Side effects, which are undesirable, but are part and parcel of urban warfare. And those pictures, therefore, tell us nothing. If you don't think that you're able to fight a war in which some people are also going to die, warrant attacking you as non-intended, right, casualties, then you can't fight at all. And this is why the West, in my mind, is such a dangerous spot, because of so many generations of people never having to fight to defend their homeland, defend themselves, their loved ones. So they've lost sight of what it means to fight war in the situation we have today. I get very afraid that if, God forbid, America or Canada or whatever it might be would be under attack, we wouldn't understand what it means actually to fight and defend our own people. And so Israel, in this respect, is sort of on the the horizon, the chalutzim, as they say, on these issues. And we have to remind everyone, and certainly ourselves, why these types of battles are justified.
Oops. Thank you. Yankel asks, can you elaborate on your discussion of individual responsibility, especially the fact that in the Ten Commandments, God promises punishment extending to future generations?
Oh, yeah, it's a great question, Uncle. So you are right. In the Bible itself, it does seem to imply in different places, including the Ten Commandments, that there is a notion of intergenerational punishment. But in the book of Deuteronomy and certainly in the later prophets, you have very strong declarations which talk about individual responsibility, which I think is the ideal, right? I mean, I think we should understand this. No one here wants to be punished for the sins of our neighbors, or no one wants to be punished for the sins of our ancestors, anything like that. We understand why. The same way, right? That we don't want our own children, grandchildren, whatnot, to be punished for that. That is something we should not strive for. However, we should note the fact that when you are part of a collective, you will share the fate and destiny in one form or another of that collective, whether you like it or not, but that's part of the nature of human nature. So the same way in which tragically, right? Sometimes it's very good. Many times, I benefited from the efforts and successes of my parents and grandparents, right? I didn't do anything to deserve that. I benefited from that. And sometimes people benefit that way, and sometimes people get harmed, and the same thing is true. Right? There might be, you have an election coming up in the United States right now. Some of you are going to be very happy with the results, some of you are very unhappy with the results, whatever the results are, right? But being part of that collective means that you're going to share the fate of those decisions. So in part, you cannot escape sharing that fate in some respects, but certainly on a purposeful level, I have no intention of either punishing or rewarding people on a group level. I only want to punish those who deserve to be punished. Hamas makes it very, very difficult, almost impossible to do that. The whole point of the invention of the laws of war, the modern laws of war, was to try to minimize the amount that civilians would be caught up in warfare. And when Hamas breaks all of those rules and places their citizens in harm's way, or their people in harm's way, this causes them to be harmed. It's a tragedy, a terrible tragedy, but nonetheless, it's something which is inevitable, and it still remains morally justified when we're doing it towards saving our own people. But you're right, the biblical legacy is complex here, and I am making certain assumptions that we follow the book of Ezekiel on this. And if you look in chapter 2 of my book, I have a much greater discussion.
Thanks. Shelley asks, is there anything in Jewish texts that would obligate the IDF to ensure safety in areas where people have fled from a city under siege?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that it's a great question. I think that the premise of this fourth side open law teaching Rabbi Natan is you want to allow people to flee and then to be able to get to a situation where they're out of harm's way. That's the goal. That was certainly the goal. It's actually achieved in Beirut in 1982. I'm not saying it was, amazing, right, to be a refugee, to have to flee, but people were able to flee for their lives, and 100,000 people fled for their lives in the summer of 1982. This would have been much more possible in the current case, as I mentioned beforehand, had the Egyptians opened up their border and created a refugee area on their side of the border. You know, I think there's a moral reckoning that has to go into this war of why the West and the UN and others let the Egyptians get away with that. It's just one of those, I know why the Egyptians didn't want to have it, but I don't know. You can't blame the Israelis always for everything. I mean, there's always this sense that Israel, which is trying to defend itself, is to be blamed for everything. There's another party, there's another border here, which could have done a lot more to prevent these types of damages. And we've been in the spirit of that biblical law.
Thank you. Whoops, thank you. And here's a really big question. Oh, where did it go?
Wait, the other ones weren't big questions?
Well, this one, listen, what's your
Okay.
solution to the end of the violence between the Jews and the Palestinians? Or are we
Okay.
to live on our swords for the rest of the days?
Okay, yeah, so that is a big question. Yeah, so that is a difficult one. Listen, in theory, as I try to argue in the book, I'm not against dividing, land for peace, whatever it might be. In practice right now, it is hard to imagine such a situation developing anytime soon. And so I think we need to be, I personally think, I mean, this is a tragedy, but that's the reality right now. The belief of some that now we're going to be able to come to some kind of two-state solution, I think is illusional. I do think that we should try to do everything we can, though, to minimize the amount of conflict and to create a situation when Gaza gets rebuilt. It should be rebuilt in a demilitarized way, in a way in which Israel won't face those threats. Israel's not occupying anything of Gaza, wasn't occupying anything of Gaza. And, whenever some ministers, regretfully think whatnot in the current government, I don't think there's any scenario in which you see Israel reoccupying parts of Gaza. And so if we can have a situation where Gaza is rebuilt in a way in which it's understood that as long as they don't fight against Israel, don't threaten Israel, they can try to build up a thriving civilization there. I think that'll be the best thing. States have a state, whatever it might be, doesn't matter. But people should live in peace and security. I think that the best way in our current situation to get to the point where Israel and Palestinians can live together in relative peace is to make sure that Hamas is truly defeated. Hezbollah is truly defeated. Because if we walk out of a war like this and they're not truly defeated, the lesson learned is going to be we can fight wars against Israel and come back and fight against them a year or two. That can't be. And so we have to have a certain amount of decisiveness the way we fight here in terms of trying to remove this threat. Do we have another partner on the side of the Palestinians that can create another government like this? Only if Hamas is actually removed from power, in my mind, is that going to be possible. Because no one else is going to be able to stand up to Hamas if Hamas isn't truly defeated. And so I hope people understand that around the world. The best thing for the Palestinians and the Israelis is for Hamas to be truly defeated in this situation. And then we can figure out how we can grant autonomy and certain areas and whatnot, and try to live in as much peace as possible. That would be great.
Thank you. What is your opinion of former members of the IDF of breaking the silence who feel compelled to challenge the actions of the Israeli government? These are Israeli citizens who speak against the government because they want to make it better.
So in a healthy democracy, which Israel, is certainly a vibrant democracy, it has its struggles like many other democracies do, but certainly a very vibrant democracy. People can certainly speak out against the policies of the government and say what they think, it's doing, the army or others are doing is wrong. And that's what being part of a democracy is all about. And that can go a lot of different directions, right? The same way that the right, meaning the political right, had the political right. Right? The Israeli right had the right of citizens to protest against the Oslo Accords or whatnot. So too, do others have the right, the civil right to protest against the government and say what they're doing is wrong. Part of the question brought the particular group that you mentioned is whether they're giving an accurate depiction of what's actually going on the ground. Meaning, part of the criticism isn't that they're criticizing the government. It's perfectly legitimate for people, Israeli citizens, to criticize this government and any other government. But you have to make sure you're doing it in an honest way. Right? So part of the criticism of that particular group is whether or not they're actually giving a complete picture of what's going on. It's hard for me to make a comment on that. There are many people who feel that that particular group is not being fully honest and transparent about what's going on. I can't, say one way or another. But in theory, in general, it's important that people should be able to be critical. People who are, I've spoken to many people who are fighting in Gaza, Lebanon, right now in this current case. It's a very small country, Israel. And the reports I'm getting from many people are they feel that we're balancing the moral needs quite well. Of course, if others feel differently in both directions, then they're entitled to say. There are some in Israel who feel that Israel's not fighting decisively enough, or we're not doing what's necessary because of American pressure, whatever it might be, in order to actually get rid of Hamas and end the war faster. There are others who say that no, we're making moral mistakes there and judgments, whatever it might be. Perfectly legitimate. as long as the people are being honest and capturing the complexity of the situation.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to answer the next question. Someone asked if you could please show the slide with the competing values again so that people can photograph it, but I want to let everyone know that a recording of this this program will be sent out to everybody, so I don't think that you need to do that right now.
Okay.
Next question is, many experts talk about the difficulty or the reality that it is impossible to eradicate an idea. What do you say about claims that Netanyahu's interests are primarily self-interest to expand the war?
Well, there are a couple of parts to that question. I mean, the idea that an ideology can't be removed from the world, ideas are very hard to remove from the world, but you can do things to make that ideology less dangerous. The KKK still exists, Nazism still exists, but they're not the types of levels of dangers that they once were because we've eliminated their political strength in different ways in order to make that no longer a threat. Those ideas still exist. As we know today, various forms of anti-Semitic ideas and different types of ideologies, right? The right and left and all around us are emerging and they're becoming threatening in certain ways. We never got rid of those ideas, but we're able to minimize some of their political power. So in the case of, let's say, whether it's ISIS still exists. You know, it's not like ISIS went away. We're able to eliminate some of its political threat. The same thing I think can be true here with Hamas and with Hezbollah. And one of the ways in which you weaken an ideology is to make the people who might be inclined to such an ideology say, you know what, this isn't working for us. This is not good for our cause. It's not good for the cause of the Palestinians or the broader people here. And so in that respect, you know, I think it's important that we make sure that the world and particularly our enemies understand it doesn't pay to adopt this ideology. You're not going to eliminate the ideology, but you can eliminate or reduce significantly the threat of that ideology. Now, when Netanyahu says this, people say sometimes, you know, he has this self-interest and political interest in mind in order to keep the war going, keep his coalition together. I don't want to get overly political. Netanyahu is not my favorite politician. Actually, for other reasons in many ways, relating to religion and state and other issues as well. But, you know, I think we should be honest that every politician has some personal self-interest in this fight. The same way, I hope what I'm saying isn't even controversial. The same way Biden and Harris have their political interests in how the war goes down right now. You see this in some of the headlines coming out of Michigan and other places, right? So too, right? Netanyahu has this political interest, but that doesn't mean you still can't judge the content of the claim on its own right. I do think that is true, that there is a value in making sure this ideology is less harmful than it once was and doesn't emerge again a year or two later as being once again just as harmful as it was on October 6th. That would be very bad. But yes, you know, there are some political interests in what mind, people's self-interest in mind. And, you know, it's something I think we should be wary of. And in healthy democracies, we have multiple factors and multiple people trying to, you know, keep those factors in mind. But let's just keep in mind, everyone who's exclaiming on the political level that Netanyahu is acting for self-interest has their own interest in mind as well. So Lapid, you know, opposition leader, has his own political interests, and Biden and Harris, and Trump, and whatever it might be, right? People have their own political interests in mind.
Thank you. And the last question is Israel morally or legally obligated to feed Gaza?
That's a great and difficult question. So I'd say the following. As we saw, the principles that we try to develop, you do not want to have a situation where you're causing unnecessary harm to those who aren't harming you. And given what we've learned from Jewish history and given from this idea of the fourth side, we don't want anyone starving and, you know, suffering from hunger that doesn't that isn't trying to harm us. So as a general principle, of course, we want to try to feed, but here's where it gets complicated. And this is readily acknowledged once again in the military handbook, the legal and ethical handbooks of both American and British armies, which assert, based on international law as well, by the way, in this case, that when the enemy side is going to take that food and use it primarily to help itself stay alive, right? In other words, it's going to become something as part of their opposition, then that obligation gets reduced. That doesn't mean it goes away, but it certainly gets reduced. I think everyone understood from the get-go, and understood very well, as soon as Israel provided, whether it's oil or food, the first people getting that are Hamas fighters. And this is in part of what has helped Hamas stay alive and be able to keep on fighting. Even though we know that they're starving, as we see from the 6 hostages that were killed, starving Israeli hostages who weren't getting any of that. So this is a deeply complex issue because you don't want to cause unnecessary harm, but you're handing over to the enemy side food for their own people, for their own fighters. And of course, one of the pressures that is typically used based on sieges is to get the people to stand up to the fighters and say, you're not representing our interest anymore. And that's been eliminated with all this pressure that's been put on Israel to provide humanitarian relief. So, I think you're a little bit stuck between a rock and a hard place here. And Israel probably made a mistake in thinking he could ever limit the amounts of goods going in. But I think it's an interesting question whether it would have worked or not. I am skeptical that in the case of Hamas, it would have worked actually not to provide food. And therefore, I think it's right that Israel has provided humanitarian measures like that in order to prevent starvation. Once again, though, I want to point out, under international law, under ethical responsibilities, a lot of these problems would have been resolved had the Egyptians fulfilled their own political and moral obligations to take people in on their side of the border.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that is the end of our questions. So I want to thank you again for your teaching about Jewish ethics of war, and your insightful perspectives on Israel's moral challenges have helped us understand the complex dilemma that Israel faces. And now I want to thank everyone for coming to learn with Rabbi Brody.